I saw a video on here earlier today where the content creator was talking about how people who are spiritualists run back to church and the reasons why. I want to share my story about my deconstruction journey and how I myself also experienced that early in my journey. So, you may or may not know, but I used to be what you would call a devout Christian. Baby, I was in church. Okay. And more so than me being in church, I was a devout Bible scholar. I studied the Bible. I was the study to show thyself approved person. I lived for studying my own word. I would say I had more of a love affair with Jesus more so than I had with the church. Now, let me go ahead and just add a caveat. Because I don't want nobody running out there being like, oh my God, this girl says she had a love affair with Jesus. I mean, I was like in love with Jesus. I was a devotee to Jesus. I walked the way of Christ. Now, knowing what I know now and walking the spiritual path that I walk now, I realized that I was destined to leave church because I was destined to leave Christianity so that I could find my own Christ consciousness within me. But before I found my own higher divinity, my own highest self, I was on a journey. Which is why sometimes when people ask me like, how long have you been on your path? I struggle with saying how long I've actually been on my path, because honestly, if I have to take the collectiveness of my journey into account, the holistic collectiveness of my journey, I would have to include the times that I was a practicing Christian, because I spent a lot of time in Christianity, but I spent a lot of time doing my own studying. So I would go to church all the time because I loved the fellowship. That is one thing that Christianity does well. It does provide fellowship, but I didn't learn a lot about Christ in church at all. I personally studied a lot on my own. And because I studied a lot on my own, I was the type of person that instead of trying to get someone to join church, I was the type of person who wanted to get you to become a follower of Christ. My motto, do y'all remember back in the day when it was WWJD, what would Jesus do? I'm dating myself, and that's okay, because I want you to understand how long I've been on my spiritual path. I was a what would Jesus do type of Christian. I did not care about what the church said. I did not care about what the pastor said, because y'all, I got some stories about church. I got some stories about some pastors, and we'll talk about that another time. But I was a what would Jesus do type of Christian. I wanted to walk the path of Jesus. And knowing what I know now, I understand that Jesus was never intending to build this Christendom that exists today. He wanted us to do what he did. He wanted us to deconstruct. He wanted us to be the revolutionary that he was. He wanted us to be able to connect to our own Christ consciousness. He wanted us to know that we are God's because the living God lives within us. And because I was more a follower of Christ, even before I was consciously aware of it, I was adhering to more of the precepts and concepts of what it is to be a awakened being, what it is to be someone who is Christ conscious, right? This also aligns with, how can I say, the concept of deconstructing from church, because that was not a word that I even knew. However, I had been deconstructing and didn't even realize that I was deconstructing. So I started being a devout Christian in 1998, as an adult in 1998. Like most Christians, I was born into Christianity. My family was Christian, so therefore by default, I was Christian. And I started my journey in 1998, September of 1998 to be exact. And how I remember some key dates is because, one, when it comes to when I began practicing Christianity as an adult, I was gifted with a Bible. Like I think most Christians, a lot of Christians are gifted with the Bible from either their church or a family member. For me, my first Bible was gifted to me by my father. I still have that Bible to this day from September of 1998. In fact, it sits in my prayer room on my altar. So I remember when I began walking a path of Christianity. I also remember when I started deconstructing from the church. I was still a member of church when I started noticing some things. I was what you would call someone who could see behind the veil. And I thought to myself, wow, this feels very much like what the scriptures say, where people are still just coming into the temple and performing the rituals and performing the rites. But there is no spirit here. God had long left those buildings, left those churches. And the more I saw it, the more I couldn't unsee it. And as such, I found myself extrapolating more and more and more. Again, I was deconstructing without the awareness that I was deconstructing. I don't even know if deconstructing from Christianity was even a term that we were using back then. Certainly it was not one that I had ever heard of. So around 2003 was when I actually stopped going to church. I continued to read my Bible. I continued to study at home. And eventually I started practicing another faith, another religion. And as a part of that, I was learning and being exposed to new mindsets, new teachings, new spiritual beliefs, and it was great. It was not church, but it was still a religious construct that I could fit into. Now, here's where the creator who said a little bit back, the story that I started off telling you, where this content creator says what happens to spiritualists when they're first on their path and they run into a life event and then they go back to church. In 2010, I had a life event that happened to me. And what I found was that my foundation in Christianity had been rooted in me so deeply that when I went through this cataclysmic event, Christianity was what I needed to hold on to get me through it. The faith that I had started practicing was not rooted deeply enough in me to help get me through this cataclysmic event, right? This tower moment, might I say. However, because I had been deconstructing for so long, it was not sustainable anymore. It did not feed me anymore. And by it, I mean Christianity. Going back to church and going back to practicing as a Christian could not sustain me. It was not enough for me where I was at that point in my life. So before the year was up, I had left the church again and I never went back. So the last time I was someone who actually even entered the doors of a church, outside of maybe going for perhaps maybe a wedding or a funeral, I have not gone to church since 2003. All right. And then I just started walking my path, exploring things, learning about other practices and mindsets. And it was a journey. So when people ask, how long have you been deconstructed and or how long have you been on your path or how long have you been awakened? Sometimes I'm like, I really need to think about that. But here's what I can tell you. If you are a new spiritualist and you find yourself deconstructed from an organized religion, especially an Abrahamic religion, and you run into a tower moment and then you go back to church, you will only stay in church to the degree that you have awakened. But because I had started awakening so much, by the time I had that tower moment and went back to church, I could only stay there for a little bit because nothing in there was resonating. Nothing in there was aligning. I could see the deception. I could see the deceit. And I was like, I can't stay here. I can't do this. And so I left. And I started walking what I now know to be a self-initiated path. And thus began my path of self-initiation and where I am today. So let's talk about this a little bit further in another video because this one's about to run out of time.